opens lines for the queen and bishop, immediately staking a claim in the center. Developing the knight towards the center immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for further piece activity. Immediately seizing central territory, this pawn pushes to contest the d-file and prepare a robust queenside pawn storm. Securing the center with this pawn establishes a solid foundation, preparing for kingside development. Developing the knight here controls key central squares and prepares for queenside expansion. Solidifying the center, this central thrust initiates a fundamental pawn clash, embracing the game's core positional struggle for central influence. Pinning the knight to the queen immediately injects tactical tension, forcing black to consider the consequences of any pawn advance. Challenging the central pawn structure, black immediately ignites a dynamic struggle, forcing white to decide how to resolve the ensuing tension. Opens the c-file, inviting immediate calculation of exchanges and potential pawn structure concessions for both sides. Exchanging pawns here opens lines but gives white a central presence. Black must immediately contest it. Unmasking the queen early here sacrifices tempo, opening avenues for black's pieces to swiftly develop and potentially threaten the exposed monarch. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal while clearing the f8 square for castling is a solid step, preparing to meet the central tension. Solidifying central space now opens up lines for your pieces. Asserting central presence and developing a piece, this knight prepares to pressure white's queen and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Regrouping the queen to safety allows for potential pawn pushes and prepares for future central control. Capturing the pawn on d5 immediately clarifies the pawn structure, opening a path for the queen. Striking the knight opens the bishop's diagonal, creating a latent threat against the castled king. Reclaiming a vital piece, black repositions their knight for greater influence and prepares for potential king's side action. Trading queens now simplifies the position, inviting a structural pawn fight and potentially opening a clear path for your rook. The queen exchange initiates a complex knight endgame where piece activity and pawn structure will dictate control. Securing the king on the queen side initiates endgame maneuvering, challenging black's central pawn structure. Activating the knight to the central square promises increased influence and potential for attacking play. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now aims to restrict black's knight and prepare for a queenside expansion. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away is a sensible priority, especially with so many pawns poised to advance and potentially expose the king's former sanctuary. Developing the knight here aims to pressure black's central pawn structure while preparing for kingside action. Expanding kingside pawn structure might feel natural, but it concedes a crucial outpost on d5 and opens the long diagonal for white's queen. This move establishes control over a key diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses and disrupting black's pawn structure. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately pressures white's c3 knight, creating an interesting positional bind. Challenging the rook's position now, aiming to seize control of the 7th rank and restrict black's minor pieces. Consolidating the queenside by bringing the rook to the 2nd rank aims to contest the d-file and support a potential c5 pawn advance. Asserting dominance over the d-file, this maneuver aims to restrict black's rook and prepare for deeper penetration. Asserting the c-file's importance, black aims to neutralize white's centralized rook and prepare for potential piece exchanges. Securing the king on the exposed queenside is paramount before further maneuvering on the open files. Recognizing the encroaching pressure on the b-file, black proactively fortifies their queenside pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside structure prepares for potential pawn advances, or simply secures the monarch against future complications. The knight tucks into a cozy outpost, eyeing the central squares and preparing to support a pawn advance. Clearing the bishop opens the c-file for queenside pressure. Reconnecting the rooks via the 3rd rank now aims to activate the king's defender and contest the open file. Sacrificing the rook here forces an exchange, opening the d-file and exposing black's king significantly. Sacrificing the rook to gain tempo and disrupt white's king safety is a bold attempt to equalize. Securing the open d-file with this recapture initiates a clear path for perpetual kingside pressure and eventual queenside expansion. Securing the monarch from the rook's sweep, black strategically repositions, preparing to contest central influence. Unleashing the passed pawn creates immediate space and tactical danger for black's king. Exposing the king to the open file is a bold gamble, potentially sacrificing long-term safety for immediate pawn gains. Unleashing a decisive pawn storm, white cleaves open the kingside and creates immediate pressure on the exposed black monarch. Reasserting knightly presence from the periphery, the dark-squared bishop now finds a potent diagonal. Unleashing the knight to centralize its influence, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for further advances. Shifting pressure to the queenside, this move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially free the knight. Pushing the pawn onward creates space and potential attacking avenues for white's pieces. Challenging the central pawn chain, this counterthrust injects immediate dynamism, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's rook. Opening a critical diagonal for the queen, this push creates immediate pressure and threatens to unravel black's defenses. Chasing that knight offers a tempo gain, but opens a clear path for the white king and creates weaknesses. Consolidating the monarch's safety becomes paramount as the game ventures into its later stages. Activating the bishop to a central outpost offers counterplay and challenges white's kingside pawn structure. Sacrificing the pawn opens a decisive diagonal for the bishop and forces the black king into a precarious position. Sacrificing pawn structure for potential activity, black aims to disrupt white's kingside dominance. A tactical punch is delivered, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and seize central control. A desperate check, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated central control and expose their king, but likely a tactical miscalculation. Unleashing the rook into the opponent's territory, disrupting the pawn structure and creating immediate threats against the black king. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the diagonal for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain. Unleashing a tactical bombshell, this knight's sortie immediately targets the exposed black king, forcing a crucial defensive reaction. Dodging the discovered attack, the black king now seeks refuge amidst the crumbling pawn structure. Re-establishing knight influence on the d4 square, aiming to harass the bishop and restrict black's central mobility. A bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and re-energize the knight's prospects. A desperate attempt to stir up activity, but it leaves the rook exposed on the 8th rank. Solidifying the knight's position and preparing to contest the crucial central files. Snapping that pawn simplifies the position, forcing the black knight into a passive defense of its king. Black snatches a pawn, but the exposed black king on the kingside creates immense vulnerability to white's advancing pawns and coordinated pieces. Securing the rook on the back rank suddenly revives white's attack. Unleashing the bishop offers a dynamic counterattack, seizing control of the dark squares and creating significant mating threats against the exposed white king. Seizing the open file with the rook, this aims to disrupt black's coordination and hunt for weaknesses on the queenside. Initiating a daring counterthrust, black seeks to exploit the open files and activate the misplaced knight. Seizing open lines, the rook actively probes for weaknesses, eyeing the exposed black king. This knight repositions to a much more active square, eyeing potential discoveries and supporting the pawn push. Consolidating the rook's influence on the 7th rank offers a solid defensive posture. Unlocking the queenside pawns offers counterplay and creates new attacking avenues. Shifting the knight back opens lines for attack on the kingside. Seeking to disrupt white's rook battery and gain tempo. Reclaiming the kingside pawn advances a powerful central majority, promising a swift endgame advantage. The king ventures out, seeking active participation in this complex endgame scenario. Exploiting the exposed black king, this pawn thrust aims to create further chaos. The king's journey to safety is fraught with peril. This maneuver gambles on finding sanctuary amongst the pawns. The rook retreats, preparing to defend the pawn and potentially hop to a more active square. Shifting the bishop to this square aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn storm and potentially create counterplay along the file. Reactivating the knight to contest black's advanced bishop and support the pawn push. King's exposed journey across the board now faces a crucial crossroads, demanding precise navigation to avoid disaster. Clearing a path for the knight to rejoin the attack on the exposed black king. King suddenly exposed by the pawn sacrifice, a dangerous retreat indeed. Unleashing the knight to its central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's exposed monarch. Black repositions the bishop to a safer square, improving its coordination with the remaining pieces. Capturing the pawn liberates your rook, threatening to sweep across the board and decimate black's remaining defenses. Shifting the knight to e5 reclaims a crucial outpost and prepares to contest the dangerous g-file. Unleashing the knight's potential on the queen side, aiming to disrupt the pawn's structure. Finally deciding to consolidate material, black exchanges their knight, aiming to simplify into a slightly better pawn structure. Sacrificing the rook here cleaves open the path to decisive material gain, leading to an overwhelming endgame advantage. Reclaiming a pawn opens up possibilities for the black king's mobility, but vigilance is paramount against white's remaining pieces. Capturing that pawn clears the c-file, opening avenues for your rooks and potentially creating passed pawns later. Venturing the king into this open central expanse invites a dangerous encounter, particularly with an opposing knight so actively positioned. Securing the d-file with the rook prevents counterplay and prepares for the final mating net. Black's bishop now eyes the white king, threatening to disrupt the advanced pawn structure with tactical possibilities. Chasing the king through the pawns, exploiting the open file for a decisive breakthrough. Protecting the knight from immediate capture, this maneuver aims to preserve material while potentially repositioning for a later pawn push. Pushing the rook to the open file seizes the initiative and creates immediate pressure on black's position. King now exposed, seeking respite amongst the remaining pawns. King's safety now paramount, white steers the king towards the active queenside pawns to gain crucial space. Committing the bishop to the queenside solidifies the pawn chain and aims to restrict white's knight. Securing the d-pawn is paramount. Its advance can open lines towards black's exposed monarch. A strategic retreat aims to reposition the bishop and potentially solidify the pawn structure, though it cedes initiative. This rook maneuver activates the piece, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and pressure the bishop on the queen side. The bishop tucks itself away, seeking safety from further aggression while hoping to regroup and menace the enemy king. Securing the king's escape square on b3 is a sensible precaution before consolidating forces further. Seeking a safe square, the black king finds a brief respite from the pawn onslaught, though its defense remains precarious. Securing the d-pawn's advance requires vigilance against black's bishop's persistent activity. Consolidating the bishop to its starting square offers greater defensive coverage and prepares for potential piece exchanges. Forcing the black king into a discovered attack with the rook offers a tactical advantage. Seeking shelter from the storm, black's king bolts towards the center, hoping to evade further checks. Sacrificing pawn control at e5 opens a dynamic confrontation, forcing a difficult choice for black's rook. A final attempt at drawing a perpetual check, hoping white's king overextends. The rook's repositioning here aims to prevent black from consolidating their piece activity on the queen side. Black's bishop finally repositions, eyeing a potential escape on the light squares after a long, defensive tenure. The rook aggressively reclaims the active square, threatening to disrupt the bishop's defensive posture. The fortress finally crumbles as black seeks to activate the bishop and disrupt white's coordination. repositioning the king to a safer square, aiming to potentially support a pawn advance or defend key squares. Seeking to outmaneuver the white rook, black's king bravely steps towards the center, hoping to disrupt white's coordination. A desperate king escape attempt, desperately seeking shelter on the queen side. King's safety is paramount now. The black monarch must avoid the dangerous open files and find sanctuary behind the pawns. Securing the pawn and preparing to advance the king's position. Suddenly, the black bishop activates, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety from a surprising diagonal. Seizing the open file, the rook now presses from the flank, targeting vulnerable pawns.